Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the meeting of September 2nd, 2008. This is the Housing Authority. Wow, what's wrong with me? Let me start this all over again. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Glendale Housing Authority meeting of September 2nd, 2008. Maybe have a roll call, please.
Authority members Draymond.
Brain doesn't fire right.
Here.
Mincy.
Here.
Najarian.
Here.
Parazian.
Here.
Quintero.
Here.
Weaver.
Here.
Chairman Yusefian.
Here. Maybe have your report, please.
The agenda for the September 2, 2008 regular meeting of the Glendale Housing Authority was posted on Thursday, August 28, 2008 on the bulletin board outside City Hall.
What's next, please?
Approval of minutes.
So moved. This is the August 5th minutes.
I'll abstain. I wasn't here.
And I will also abstain. With those two abstentions, the minutes will be approved as submitted. What's next, please?
Item 5 is oral communications. Discussion is limited to items not a part of this agenda. Each speaker is allowed 5 minutes. Members of the authority may question or respond to the speaker, but there will be no debate or decision. The matter may be referred to staff through the executive director for investigation and report.
Okay, I have one card. Herbert Mulatto.
Good afternoon. My name is Herbert Mulatto, members of the Housing Authority and city staff. It's been now close to 3 months since this Housing Authority gave instructions to staff to proceed with the quality of life indicators. I had the opportunity to talk to Lynn Brandstater, and she says that the ball is now back in your court. I did have a chance to talk to Sam Engel and his assistant, and it appears that they're really quite busy and fully, their staff is pretty much booked up with regard to their current set of obligations. And so I don't see much movement with regard to the last 3 months with actually moving this process forward. And I guess I'm assuming that this whole authority was presenting to council, to staff, this particular request. I think that beginning the process of making policy decisions based upon some type of data, the data that basically comes to you via a document such as this one, is essential. I'll give you some personal information with regard to the difficulties that I've found in the last few months as a landlord in collecting rents. They've been getting, late, more and more so every month in the past few months, and I check with other landlords, and they're finding a similar trend. I can only extrapolate from that there will be a significant number of families who are finding difficulties maintaining or paying the rent on time or maintaining their households in Glendale. So I would imagine that data that comes to you on a current basis, on a frequent basis, to let you know what is happening with regard to the needs of the residents, to allow you then to revise your policies or maybe create new policies to address that particular need. I was going to suggest that perhaps we could get, on a periodic basis, other measures such as bankruptcies or evictions due to non-payment. It's the data that allows you to make good policy. But when years go by and you don't get this kind of information, I don't see how you can make the right policy or the fair policy with regard to issues such as housing or issues about youth and so on. I would like to see the day when this agency and the City Council creates policy based upon hard data and sets measures to basically alleviate the problems that residents may have or problems that you begin to address early on, when the leading indicators tell you these are problems that we're going to face. And I don't know if there's anything wrong with this type of advocacy, but this is something that is fairly common, in the best-run cities in the U.S. And I can point you to the cities and the statements basically of how it is that they manage their policies. And it's often based upon hard data that they've collected on a periodic basis. The city of Pasadena funds individuals for precisely that type of policy making, providing the data on a regular basis, and is a fully staffed position. And so does the city of Santa Monica, just to name you a couple of cities. So it is my continual request that the city move forward and that this that the Housing Authority look at this opportunity to get periodic information so that you can adjust your policies or create new policies if need be. Thank you.
So, Mr.
Am I confused, or isn't this set to come up before us, this quality of life, in the next few weeks? I was under the impression this...
No, not a few weeks.
It was not?
No, let me see if I can recall correctly, Mr. Mayor, Mr. Chair. You took the matter up. It had previously been, when it was last done, the task of the Glendale Healthy Cities. You referred the matter to the Glendale Healthy Cities, although not on their agenda. You encouraged them to take the matter up, and I believe the response we had was they would, and we're working on eliciting support from groups and community members to support that effort. I'm not aware of what the ball is back in the city's court means, but we'll check again with the Glendale Healthy Cities and be happy to get you a status report of their effort.
Mr. Starbird, I did take an opportunity to talk with Sam Engel after last week. He is letting me know that they are working on this issue. As a matter of fact, in order to gather some of the information, they are going to be using some part-time individuals, and they are writing the job description for some of those individuals so they could go ahead and get them, and some of them happen to be volunteers. So he's trying to track those down and figure out who's going to be doing that.
You're one step ahead
and they're
of me.
going to work with the department heads who have said that they'll be more than happy to cooperate. So it just, the bureaucracy takes some time to get certain things done, and of course, this is not the only item on his docket. He's got a lot of other stuff to deal with. So,
And if I can, Mr. Chair, it's not the city's undertaking, although Mr. Engel and his staff are supportive of the Glendale Healthy
Right.
Kids effort. It will be their effort as it was last time. We'll certainly cooperate and be supportive, but you're right. The effort last time took far longer than several months to conclude. If I recall, it was more than a year to pull the relevant data together and prepare their report. This isn't going to happen overnight.
right. Thank you. Any other comments? Hearing none. Oral communications closed. What's next, please?
At item 6A, Director of Community Development and Housing, regarding Section 8 waiting list overview. At 6A1 is a motion to note and file the report.
Okay. With that, I'll go to Mr. Starbird.
I'll go to you, Peter. And I'll go to Peter Zovak, Assistant Director for Community Development and Housing, for the staff report. Peter?
Yes, Mr. Chair, members of the Housing Authority, the Section 8 Housing Choice Voucher Program is a rental housing program for lower income, rental housing subsidy program for lower income households. The Glendale Housing Authority has administered the Section 8 program since 1977, when they received an allocation of 200 Section 8 certificates at that time. The program title of Section 8 comes from subsection 8 within the Housing and Community Development Act of 1974, how it's got its name. For the 08-09 fiscal year, the program is budgeted at approximately $27 million, all of which is funding received from the Department of Housing and Urban Development. No general funds support this program. On a monthly basis, an average of $1.6 million in rental subsidy payments are made to Glendale landlords on behalf of program clients. The program is fully subscribed and contains a waiting list that was created back in 2001. Community Development and Housing staff receives inquiries on the status of the waiting list on a regular basis, and it was determined that an update on that would be beneficial to both the Housing Authority and the members of the public. The report before you provides information as to how the current waiting list was established and how it is managed. This report is for informational purposes only, and no action other than receiving and file this report is being requested. To present the report, I'd like to call up Senior Community Development Supervisor Carolina Siegler and Administrative Analyst Joseph Rodarte. And we have a PowerPoint presentation, and you've all received copies of the presentation.
Good afternoon, Chairman, Housing Authority board members, and city staff. As Peter had mentioned, I'll jump right into the PowerPoint. As Peter had mentioned, a couple of statistical items that I'd like to talk about are that the Glendale Housing Authority is the actual fourth largest housing authority program in LA County, behind LA County, LA City, Long Beach, and then Glendale. He mentioned it was federally funded. It is so no city money is used to subsidize the program. Currently, through an annual contributions contract with the Department of Housing and Urban Development, we received 1,592 HUD-authorized vouchers. Basically, those are the individuals that are allowed to participate on our program, and we need to maintain and fully lease that. In addition to that, we also administer an additional 1,262 incoming portable families. Incoming portable families are voucher holders from other housing authorities that choose to utilize their subsidy assistance within the City of Glendale jurisdiction. In order to continue to meet the 1,592 vouchers that we receive and remain fully funded, a waiting list is established. The waiting list was created, like Peter said, in 2001. But before its creation, we needed to establish a couple of things based upon the previous waiting list. We learned of some issues. The previous waiting list used an open date and time system. This new, as I will show, this new waiting list will highlight the innovations and also the uniqueness of this specific waiting list. So in 1999, the PHA received approval to reopen its waiting list, and in doing so, wanted to go ahead and establish using the waiting list objectives. As our dwindling pool of applicants came to an end, we needed to identify that we also needed to replenish that pool. The next goal was to minimize disruption of services to current owners and tenants. We realized in the previous waiting list that there were times where we were inundated with so many applicants that and paperwork that it was almost impossible to operate the daily operations of the program. So the third item and objective that we wanted to meet was to promote an open and equitable, convenient application access, because there was a couple of issues that occurred in the previous one that was a concern as far as intake as well. So what we wanted to do is meet those three objectives, and the Housing Authority did so. In 2001, during a 3-week period in January, the Housing Authority there was received 12,553 applicants were received under our new system. Now, to meet the other objective of establishing a minimized disruption of services, the Glendale Housing Authority realized that it was a massive undertaking. So what it did is it went through an RFP process and secured a third-party clearinghouse, Wilden Corporation, to handle the intake, data quality, and also the quality control of all applicants to ensure that. Lastly, to ensure the convenience to the public and access, you had the application process was distributed via local newspaper, website, community centers, and 800 number. Our current waiting list, which is very unique and identifies a preference point system that was approved in 1999 by the Housing Authority. The preference point system was established to follow and meet 3 identified marks. It serves as the greatest community needs. It identifies within the community these preference points to make sure that the individuals that need the assistance are utilized or are able to be pulled up through the waiting list first and foremost. It also provides a clear delineation of levels of need so that you can identify statistically and also where those areas are that you do need to address. And lastly, it provided a fair and equitable and reasonable system of waiting list management for us. The preference points are in 9 total categories, and they're listed before you to identify certain areas where you have certain preference points that are of higher worth or higher value than others. The identified areas are 3 that are of 12 preference points, and that would be displaced by government action, homeless living shelters, victims of hate crime, which also includes the VAWA Act, Violence Against Women Act, and then those are the 3 top. What you have on the bottom is you'll have in the middle section you'll have the U.S. veterans, which qualified for 6 preference points, and then the list of all the remaining 5 preference points, where each are worth 1 point assigned to each one of those. Now, each application on the waiting list is based upon the cumulative preference points of these at the time the application was taken. So if an individual certified and self-certified on the application that they met the qualifications for these preference points, then that's where that would be the criteria that was used to do the placement. Now that brings up the issue of the placement on the waiting list. Taking the cumulative preference points, each individual was assigned to a database. The database, in essence, ran through a computerized query, and assigned a random number to each individual application. 12,553 applications were assigned or were received. 12,553 randomly assigned numbers. At that point, what is described is that each application is assigned to the waiting list by a two-step sorting process. The sorting process is first the preference points. The maximum number of preference points an individual can receive is 47 points. The minimum, or the lowest amount, is 0. So based upon those 47 individual little buckets it created, the individuals were placed according to their application, cumulative applications point score, and assigned that randomly assigned number was then used to go ahead and differentiate, or to assign and chronologically put in order those individuals based upon the randomly assigned number within each category of the preference points. Some of the with each applicant's preference points verified at the time of the application is pulled from the waiting list. You want to make sure what ends up happening is you want to make sure that at the time that they qualify for the time that the application is taken in and they're pulled from the waiting list, that everything is verified. And I'll get into security and monitoring in just a couple of slides, but just to touch base on that. Qualified individuals move towards the next step of voucher issuance. Unqualified applicants are removed or replaced in waiting list according to correct number of preference points. In essence, an individual has one of two options. When you are pulled from the waiting list, you are given to an individual to process the eligibility. The determination is met upon whether they do meet the criteria. If they do meet the criteria, they are then placed and continue the voucher issuance process. If they don't meet the criteria, and if they fall short of whatever identified preference points they do have, they are placed back on the waiting list accordingly. All applicants are subject to HUD screening and eligibility processes, which brings me to the next issue, or the next activity. One of the HUD screening and eligibility criteria that's mandatory of all individuals on the waiting list is that you have to go ahead and report any changes in income and address and other identified areas on the application. This in turn will affect the waiting list position of each applicant. There's also another identified area that will affect the position of individuals on the waiting list will be the purging of the waiting list. The purging of the waiting list is taking individuals, having mailers sent out to them to gauge interest. You want to make sure that you're keeping the most up-to-date waiting list as possible to make sure you're pulling the applicants accordingly. This is done on a monthly basis. 200 mailers are identified. The mailers are sent out, received. Individuals that do not respond are then sent out a letter indicating that they will be removed from the waiting list if no responses or no action is taken. Changes in the waiting list. The average monthly turnover is 14 vouchers. That's actually to the Housing Choice Voucher Program. That's not to the waiting list. It's actually indicating vacancies on our program. Vacancies only occur on the program due to tenant termination, which is self-sufficiency. A family has come to the point where the program no longer suits their needs because they have enough sufficient income to go ahead and provide for themselves without the assistance of the Housing Authority or voluntary withdrawal for whatever reason. The PHA also terminates accordingly due to fraud, noncompliance, and or death. As I mentioned, there are internal controls to the waiting list. Some of the security features of this is we have centralized the process. So there are 19 housing authorities, 19 housing employees in the department. Only one has one right to make changes to the waiting list. It limits access, thereby attributing responsibility and identifying any sort of changes that have not occurred without authorization. The next would be our software system. The elite software system that we have is time date stamped. It also monitors individuals' actions within the system. So an individual can, our IT department can research who did what in the system and identify those individuals.
Who's the one who has the control?
Right now, the individual is the senior administrative assistant, and what she does is she processes the preliminary eligibility of the waiting list individuals when they're initially pulled. And I also will get into the process that it follows from there on in to verify that.
Okay.
The internal auditing before the individual that does the intake of the applications or pulling of the applications from the waiting list. The individual, usually in management, will go ahead and authorize the list that's being pulled, thereby double-checking to make sure that the individuals were next in line to be pulled from the waiting list. And last but not least, to add another security measure to the waiting list, we have the applications are also under lock and key, only opened for access by the individual, and once again, the keys are actually are held by a couple of individuals, but for security purposes. The monitoring process on the waiting list occurs in 3 levels. The individual that pulls the waiting list or that pulls the applications will take the preliminary look at the file, draw the report to make sure that it was due and run at the appropriate time and pulled in the same fashion. The next process would be that it forwarding, if it meets the criteria, into the hands of a housing advisor. The housing advisor is well trained on making the determination as to income qualifications, preference qualifications, identifying fraudulent activity and such. And the third level, before a voucher can even be issued to an individual, it's reviewed by a supervisor to give the acceptance and say that it's okay to further process. And at that point, it goes through a checks and balances of 3 individuals. Last but not least, we have a public awareness. The public awareness wanted to speak specifically about portables. In 2003, we identified that we ran approximately and administered 30 portables in a year from other housing authorities. However, in mid-2003, we started identifying a trend of an increasing portable individuals that are coming into the city of Glendale from other housing authorities, more specifically from the Housing Authority of the City of Los Angeles. Proactively, the Housing Authority made discussions with the City of Los Angeles to waive their one-year residency requirement, because they found out that numerous voucher holders were residing within the city of Glendale but unable to use their voucher because of the waiver, because of the residency requirement. So we were able to go ahead and have that cleared so that it would able to open the gates to the city of Glendale for additional families to be leased up within the city's jurisdiction. This, however, it doubled the program size within a 4-year span. We went from a moderate program of 1,400, to receiving an additional 1,262 vouchers currently, therefore doubling the amount of individuals that we assisted. However, this process may have contributed to, by public perception, may have contributed to the perception that they may be being bypassed on the waiting list. Because an individual from another housing authority may not be on our waiting list. However, they may lease up in the city of Glendale, receive a contract, and may have the perception that they received a voucher from the city of Glendale. It also can be that numerous individuals may have put their names on our waiting list and other housing authority waiting lists, and were served, were served first by another housing authority. We also
were they removed from our list?
At this particular time, no. It's policy, administrative policy, high policy, not to remove the individual from the waiting list when they port over from another housing authority. The reason being is you never know what can happen to an individual situation. If they decide to leave the program, their name may still remain on our waiting list, and they may need the assistance when their number's called up again.
Mr. Starbird.
While we're on this topic, to be clear, LA City opened or essentially waived the one-year requirement. Subsequently, they'll reestablish the one-year requirement.
Subsequently, they have reestablished the one-year
So this was sort of a one-time thing that they did because, frankly, they were falling behind in their lease-up, and as a result, were getting in trouble with HUD. So this assisted them a great deal. Two is when one of these transfers becomes vacant, do we administer its filling, or does it go back to the city of origin?
The file actually is transferred back to the city of origin.
So although we may be administering them maybe here, when they become vacant, somebody dies, moves off the program, we don't get to fill it from our list. It goes back, in the case of most of them, goes back to the city of Los Angeles, and they draw off of their list and they administer it.
Yeah, because I remember it used to be more than 1,200.
It does. It
1,500 at
right.
one point.
Yeah.
So the numbers.
At its peak, it was at around 1,500.
Yeah.
And to add to Mr. Starbird's comments on that, the individual does go back, the file and everything does go back to the housing authority, but he had mentioned, I'm sorry, Mr. Starbird, what did you say previously on the previous comment?
On the one-year waiting?
On the one-year waiting list. They did waive that initially. They have closed it, but there is the possibility if an individual still resides within the city of Glendale that they can use reasonable accommodation and approach the other housing authority. There are other ways to make sure that an individual that truly needs to use and remain in Glendale does receive the assistance.
When we accepted the LA vouchers, my concern was that that would in fact limit or impact the availability of units here in the city of Glendale for Glendale residents. Did we ever do any follow-up? Did we ever try to figure out whether that could have been the case or was the case? In other words, if you have more vouchers coming in from out of the city, you're a landlord?
So far, to my knowledge, we haven't done any sort of focus or study on that. It could be something that we would identify and see the effects that it has had, but from being at working within the department on a daily basis, you get to see that the availability of units are still out there. It would take approximately, to fill one vacancy, it usually takes about 2 to 3 voucher holders. So not everyone is finding and able to lease up within the city, but the ratio from voucher holder to an actual contract within the city is a lot lower than it would be in most housing authorities.
So Starbird.
And I think what we found is at that time we had a number of Glendale residents who were on the LA list.
Mm-hmm.
And they were going to have to then move into LA to take advantage of it. So they were our residents, they were on LA's list, they got picked on LA's list, hadn't been picked on ours. They were going to have to move from here into LA, do their 1 year, and then move back again. That was the chief complaint we received based as to LA's policy, is that people are going to have to move from an established residence in Glendale, go into LA, find a unit, and then having done their year, then they could transfer back in again.
Which they can do still now.
Which they can do now. But at that time, that continues to be their policy. At that time, there were a good number of those people, as I recall, were actually Glendale residents at the time, that LA was giving them a voucher.
And most of them, to add on to that, most of them were leases in place, which would be basically that they live in their current residence and were able to use that residence as the contracted out unit.
Okay. Tell us about the fraud.
Right before that, really briefly, Councilmember Najarian had mentioned in a couple of meetings back regarding the influence of individuals in the placement. We wanted to reiterate and make sure that everyone does understand that no entity, no individual from any department can influence the waiting list, can't influence an individual being placed on the waiting list as well. As far as the fraud, all inquiries are investigated. Any sort of inquiry brought by the public is investigated. We have a fraud department dedicated to that. We have one individual, we had our other individual retire, but we have one individual currently handling those inquiries and such. And also the housing authority advisors that handle the caseloads are well trained on the dynamics of fraudulent activity and and identifying that.
If you had two investigators, now you only have one, is one enough?
Currently, one is enough. I think kind of a catch-22. You have two individuals. They do such a good job. You really don't need. You may not need the other individual. Our caseload has dropped dramatically as far as fraudulent cases that are open. So, in that to answer your particular question, one is sufficient, but we're actually looking into the possibility of identifying other areas, maybe police cadets or so forth that may be interested in getting on-the-job training in such areas. So just to give an example. But we're kind of in discussions on that one right now.
Are you going to go over the percentages of the income? Who's getting it mostly, which is in the staff report, it's not in your...
The percentages?
Yeah, it's not in your PowerPoint presentation.
Mr. Chair, is he done with the presentation yet?
Just
I've been saving my questions, so...
Sure, just one more, just on the accomplishments of the actual waiting list. The waiting list was actually its establishment. The way it was created, received received an award of merit from the National Association of Housing and Redevelopment Officials, a well-recognized organization within the housing industry that identified the innovation, how the project went down, how it was completed, and the opening and closing activities. Also wanted to point out that the CMAP certification, which is a Section 8 management assessment program, it's a self-certification done annually by the Housing Authority and submitted to HUD, whereby HUD will then randomly select housing authorities to audit. We have received the highest performance since its inception as a high performer annually. And that would conclude my presentation.
So, explain to me a little more about the buckets. 0 to 47.
Sure.
Is a bucket like all those that got like 47?
Exactly. You have a maximum total of 47 points if you take every single preference point and identify that. Now, there may be 0 individuals, and in fact, there were 0 individuals that received 40.
Okay, say 44 versus 40. So everybody in 44 is ranked randomly by computer.
Everyone was assigned a random number initially, then the preference points took over. So everyone was placed on the waiting list according to preference points buckets. Within those preference point buckets, the randomly assigned number will then designate where your position falls.
Okay, but all 44s would go before a 40.
All 44 preference points, yes.
So work your way down to the total numbers.
Correct.
Okay, and that list stays for how many years?
Until it's exhausted.
Okay, if somebody comes in, gets a new one, and they jump up into like the 44, that's why all the others would move down a notch, because somebody's been added to a bucket above.
I'm sorry, Councilman Weaver.
If they're all 44 and another one comes in, new one, ranks 44, then everybody else on the list drops one slot because you have somebody new at the 44 bucket.
If I can just use this example really quick right behind you. I brought this slide just in case we were able to have this discussion. The 4 points, it designates a category, a preference point category.
I understand that.
So if you have Mr. Smith, Mrs. Smith, Mr. Jones, and Mr. Blue with the respective application or the randomly assigned numbers, if let's say Mr. Paul makes a change on the waiting list and he jumps up and causes him to move up into the 4 preference category because his income has gone to extremely low income, he would then move into the position between Mrs. Smith and Mr. Jones.
And if Mr. Gold is a new applicant and falls in the 4-point category, he would move down below 1195.
The actual waiting list was only open for a 3-week period. It's closed.
So if somebody wasn't here in 2001, 2,
until it's exhausted.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Okay.
One of the reasons why with the old list, even though it was getting smaller, it still had a lot of names on it, you decided to reopen it again. Because such a large number of years had gone by. I think 10 years or so had gone by.
The other question I had, You send out 200 per year, the periodic updates,
Per month.
or, excuse me, per month. You send 200 out. How do you know they got them? Because if they don't respond, what do you do?
We give them the opportunity, if they're not responding, they have up to a year to go ahead and question the cancellation. So, and we have had cases where they said, you know what, we haven't moved, we've moved. But it's their responsibility to identify and submit those changes.
My concern is if you mail it and they never received it, and they say, you never got it, because we do mailings all the time. People say, I didn't get it. What if it got junked or something? They don't know that you've asked them. You don't do a follow-up to say, hey, did you get our letter, do you? Or do you send it registered mail so you know they got it?
Just to answer the question, we send, the first update goes out regular mail. If they don't respond to it within 15 days, then we send another update out regular mail, and then a cancellation letter will go out registered mail. And then they are canceled, and like he stated, within a year, they could ask for reinstatement.
Right. They've got 3 chances, the last one being registered mail. Okay.
Mr. Quintero?
Do we have, as a housing authority, do we have the ability to increase the veterans' points from 6 to 12 to go along?
We've actually exhausted, and every time we're serving currently 5 preference points. So if an individual was identified as a U.S. veteran, he would jump to the top of the waiting list, which is why it's kind of an innovative way to do a waiting list. There's no individual can jump onto the waiting list as it's closed, so that situation, I don't think it would happen, though.
Well, the reason I'm mentioning it is that obviously there's going to be an awful lot of servicemen and women that are going to be coming back to the community. Many of them are going to not be in very good shape, and so I'm wondering what we can do as an authority when someone in social service happens to run into a veteran, whether it's at the employment department or wherever it is, that they become aware that there's a possibility of establishing a Section 8 voucher for them.
At this time, there's actually nothing that we can do on the Section 8 program or the Housing Choice Voucher program, because we can't add additional items unless we were able to receive some sort of special funding from the federal government that targets that population. Then there would be nothing we can do in that particular situation.
In other words, we'd have to open the list again. It'd have to be a total open list.
It would have to come to that, and the magnitude of doing that, I don't know if it would be.
How long has it been since we?
2001.
2001.
2001.
Mr. Starbird?
Well, maybe we should ask the question more directly. Could the city council decide to have a limited opening, say as a result of the current conflict? The council asked to open the list only for individuals who would qualify as veterans and who also might meet some other criteria. Could they do that under HUD guidelines?
I don't believe you could, and one reason I say that is that actually HUD has been working with the Veterans Administration in coming up with a voucher program for returning veterans. And so it's actually something that they're trying to roll out right now, in which the Veterans Administration has received a certain number of vouchers, and they are trying to place, somewhat like a portable voucher, place them in different communities close to supportive services.
Because it would be unlikely, given the 2001 establishment, that any veterans from the current conflict are likely going to qualify and have already been on the list. Right. And it was interesting to me, as noted, since you're working with 5 points, currently down to working with people with 5 points, that means there are no longer any victims of hate crimes, no longer persons displaced by government action, no longer any homeless, including victims of domestic violence, and you're down to the point that there's no longer any veterans or survivor of U.S. veterans. It's everybody down below those 4 categories now that you're down to.
Correct, but they do have the ability to make that change, though, since they are on the wait list. If something should change and they meet that criteria.
Right, but they first have to be on the list.
Correct.
And then, for example, if it were well, now at this point, in order to be a veteran, they'd have to have not been a veteran at the time they got their name on the list, but subsequently have become a veteran.
Correct.
Doesn't seem highly likely that would occur.
Not highly likely.
Well, I'd like to see the staff work with the VA and, give us a report. Let's establish some links with them and see what's available and how we can go ahead and plug into this program.
Any other question? Mr. Najarian?
Question. You answered my first question about currently when I
direct questions to your department, we talk about a 5-point system. So you explained that the other categories that offer more than 1 point have been exhausted. And I don't even want to say this too loudly, but are you telling me that if someone with point claims that they are a victim of domestic violence, they're automatically going to receive a Section 8, and they can prove domestic violence, they're automatically going to receive a Section 8 voucher?
The process in those particular cases is it's identified within the VAWA Act, the Violence Against Women Act, and if an individual does identify themselves as such, we do go through the process of doing the certification. It does have to go through an accommodation process whereby certifications are sent out to physicians and so forth, knowledgeable agencies, law enforcement and such, to verify and corroborate the story and or the incident. So the due diligence is done, and they will receive the preference points if they are correctly identified as that.
But they still have to be on the list.
They do have to be on the list.
Okay, so nobody gets an idea of going out there beating up their wives thinking that they're going to be on the list. So this is people who are already on the application. So don't get any wild ideas.
I'm thinking.
No. We don't want to even suggest that or recommend that or even talk about it. No, it's a bad idea.
Thank you.
Okay, I have, thank you. Please sit down. And I have a couple of cards. Let's go to Herbert Milano. Three minutes. Good enough?
All right.
Talk fast.
Make it brief. Members of the Housing Authority, my name is Herbert Milano. I want to speak to you with regard to, as a landlord who has participated and who is participating in Section 8, that it is a program that which I enrolled in order to, as a request from Madeline Blake, so that I could learn about the program firsthand, experience the process, and then be able to promote it to other landlords in the city of Glendale. And if there are any landlords listening, I think that it's a worthwhile program that for landlords to get in and hopefully expand the number of units available to those individuals who are in desperate need of housing. What I would like to make is a few pointers with regard to perhaps a reevaluation of the way points of preference are given, or the way an evaluation is done to those currently receiving the program. I like to, in my mind, look at the difference between those individuals who have what I would call a permanent situation that they cannot help. For example, like a disability, or a single mother with a disabled child, let's say with MS, or something that takes a fairly significant toll on their life and their income, versus individuals who have a temporary situation that would be changed. So if you take, for example, an able-bodied individual under 62 who gets Section 8 housing, who's an adult, and perhaps an adult couple, you would imagine that 5 years later something economically would have changed. Either they improved their English, their job prospects got better, and so forth. And I think it would be interesting to find out how many individuals who have been on the program, who are able-bodied, who've been on the program for over 5 years, still are claiming the issue with extreme low income. Because I believe that those are the individuals who have a permanent situation at home, like single parent with a disabled child, should really be looked at with regard to preference, and perhaps review the way these individuals with a very long record of assistance can be viewed. I would also even suggest perhaps that other types of records be looked at. For example, the type of automobile they drive, or the type of insurance for the type of automobile that is at their disposal, as perhaps another indicator that perhaps those individuals may not necessarily, or may be subject to further review. I think that as a society we should look out for those individuals who have the most fragile situation. And I think that those parents, especially if they're single with a child who is disabled, should get our utmost attention. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Anita Pesler.
Hi.
Your name,
Yes.
please.
Anita Preisler.
Preisler. Sorry for pronouncing
Close. I have to agree with this gentleman. I'm with the Red Cross, and 99% of my clients, or become my clients, and become homeless because their apartments or homes burned down. And it just seems like a lot of these people do not have insurance, or even renter's insurance. And it's the same situation. They are now homeless. So a lot of times they're over 62. They've been a resident of Glendale. They've been living alone, and they're low income. And when I try to find out about getting them on Section 8 to help them out, I'm told, don't bother. The list is closed, and there's nothing we can do about it. And, I mean, these people they're on the edge of becoming homeless. And not all of them, no. But a lot of them are on the edge of becoming homeless. And as we increase the homeless population, it costs Glendale more money. Thank you.
Thank you. I think it's important for the populace to know that 85% of the individuals who are on Section 8 are SSI, SS, and pension. So these are retired, they're getting SSI. Only 15% actually earned wages, and based on the staff report, 7% of the 15% is general relief. I don't know what TANF means. You know,
welfare.
It's welfare. So 7% is on welfare, and 8% have other income, which means they probably have some kind of a job, but it's falling below the median income. So those are where you're going to see the flexibility is going to be. Somebody, their welfare is after 5 years, they have to be off, or they did better job, or whatever, their working body, and they're going, or they're able to get better job and make more money and then fall out. So as you can see, 85% of people are going to be there for a long time because they're already retired, so they're not going to go anywhere. Anyway, so currently I think there is 7,666 people who are on the list. So let me ask you a question. You do this every 200 at a time. Out of 200 that you send out every month, how many of them do you actually cancel out because they are no longer relevant, or maybe they're no longer among the living, or they move to another state? I mean,
I'm going to be guessing that it's about 20% probably get canceled. They don't respond. We send out 200 updates per month, and we're doing it for that reason because it's manageable. We can enter those updates into the computer rather quickly. Within 30 days, send the person a receipt that your update was received. This is how your points have changed. If we were to do the whole waiting list at one time, it'd be almost unmanageable to enter all those updates.
and the waiting list that you have, do you have phone numbers for those individuals?
Yes.
Do you also follow up by a phone call?
We can call if something comes back undeliverable is returned. We have access to GWP records. We can see where someone moved. We can contact them at their new address if they've given us a forwarding address.
But you do that. So if your return receipt required comes back and says it's undeliverable, that's when we
make
call.
other attempts. Yes.
Okay. All right. Any other questions? Okay.
Do you need a motion now?
Is there a motion to notify?
So moved.
For a second?
Second.
Okay. Roll call.
Authority members Draymond.
I'm sorry.
I was just asking, do you need a roll call for a note to follow?
There's a motion.
It's a motion.
It can be done by consensus too, but the chair is called, so
I got to give her something
the
to do.
word would be yes.
Call for the roll.
Authority members Draymond.
Yes.
Mency.
Yes.
Najarian.
Yes.
Grazian.
Yes.
Quintero.
Yes.
Weaver.
Aye.
Chairman Yusefian.
Aye. Is there a motion to adjourn?
So moved.
We're adjourned. Sorry, I forgot that. Was there any comments? Too late.
You made them all,
All
Mr.
yours.
Chair.
I made them all.